The water's off the coast of Nice, a little early and chilly for sunbathing, 65 degrees. But unlike last year, the water temperature should not be a problem. As we get set for the start now, let's get a word from my colleague, Olympic gold medalist John Neighbor.
At the sound of the gun, friends are going to become like strangers, as it's every man for himself. An early lead transforms into a substantial advantage, and being stuck in the middle of the pack is rather dangerous. With all these arms flailing and legs thrashing, you can get hurt out there. In fact, the organizing committee's hired 3 frogmen standing by in case of a needed rescue. Now, for the swimmers who get out ahead of the pack, their goal is to begin drafting. This is finding yourself immediately behind a swimmer in front and using them for direction, and in fact, you may even find yourself being pulled along by their weight.
And here's a picture that always makes you look twice. 700 athletes towing a starting line that points them out to sea. The countdown in French, and the World Championship is underway.
The organizing committee planned to have all the athletes start from a stretch of beach 20 yards wide, but as you can see, they've spread themselves out over a full 100 yards, giving a clear advantage to the swimmers on the left of the screen there. They have the shortest path to the first turn, and by some strange coincidence, most of the pre-race favorites are in their prime position right now.
The swim course is a 2-mile loop, which is marked by buoys. The early leaders have already separated themselves from the rest of the swimmers. And in the group of leaders is the Ironman Dave Scott, who is certainly one of the most versatile athletes out here and proves he can slug it out with the rest of the top swimmers.
Notice he's got a very strong turn. He swims accustomed to choppier water, the rough water swims. And although he looks a little bit sloppy above the surface, underwater he's got a very efficient stroke. Here, circumnavigating the globe, there passing in the center is Charlie Graves. He's a lifeguard and the swimming specialist. He takes pride in getting out of the water first. He's got a beautifully smooth stroke, keeping everything as close to the surface of the water as he can. He swam this course yesterday, trying to determine his line of attack, and so he doesn't need to follow another swimmer. Although the pack is thinned out nicely, they're still taking great advantage in the direction that Charlie Graves has established towards the turnaround buoy. In hot pursuit here on the bottom of the screen is Yves Cordier, the local favorite. He lives here in Nice. And on top in the pink wetsuit is Scott Molina, the man everybody fears and most chose as the pre-race favorite. Now fighting it out for 4th position is Mark Allen in the wetsuit and Dave Scott on the near side of the screen. They're trying to struggle to keep that line behind Molina where the going is a lot easier. Allen probably has the advantage by wearing this wetsuit because it wards off the cold and it keeps him more buoyant. But Dave Scott is more of a purist. He's not a wetsuit kind of guy. No high-tech equipment for him. He just likes to slug it out. And at 31 years of age, this 4-time Ironman champion doesn't want to betray weakness.
I like to be in the lead. I like people to worry about Dave Scott. I like to have a look at the back of my head. I don't like to look at theirs. If I'm on the lead, they can't see my expression. I'm hurting as bad as they are, but they don't know it.
Hi everybody, Ross here, and this is episode 21 of the Streak podcast. The audio you just heard was from the 1985 Nice Triathlon, a race that I'll speak more about later. I'm back on the mic because a few weeks ago I finished my 37th consecutive triathlon season. I'm planning to do a season review video soon. But in summary, I raced 11 times, 5 Olympic distance races and 6 sprint distance races. This included 8 local events, a 2-race UK swing, and a train trip to Berlin for a race. Although my training is kinda minimalist and my equipment is very simple, I still like to race gun to tape. This resulted in me winning my age group 9 times and getting second twice. At the first race of the year in Oberschleißheim, the water was 15.2 degrees centigrade. That's pretty cold, but once I got moving, it was fine. However, the conditions did get me thinking about wetsuits. My first one, my favourite one, the one I'd love to get hold of, and the history. I bought my first wetsuit, a sleeveless Triathlon Pro, from Total Fitness in Swindon at the end of 1989. See the show notes for a picture of it, from Triathlete UK in 1988. It's the one with the red sides. I also included an ad with the Triathlon Pro range of suits from 1987. And take a look at those 1988 Terrapin suits. Wasn't it great when not all wetsuits were black? In those show notes at thestreakpodcast.com/podcast/21, underneath the Triathlon Pro ads, you can also see a blurry photo of me wearing the tiny Triathlon Pro. It was taken by my brother at the 1990 Swindon Triathlon. The image quality is not really there, as I'm in frantic motion, and he took the shot on a waterproof disposable camera, but he really got himself in a great position at the swim exit. 1989 was my first season in the sport. I did 9 triathlons that year, 4 in a pool and 5 open water events without a wetsuit, including the British Junior National Championships at Holme Pierpont. This venue has some vital UK wetsuit history that I'll discuss later. I didn't get to Total Fitness very often, so on the day I bought the Triathlon Pro, I also picked up a copy of Mark Allen's Total Triathlete, and then walked down Swindon High Street to Our Price and bought But Seriously by Phil Collins on cassette. Total Fitness was owned by triathlete and fishing enthusiast Trevor Gunning. With John Lilly, the founder of 220 magazine, Trevor also formed Total Promotions to put on events. They organised the Swindon Triathlon from 1988 onwards. In 1991, the race was absorbed into the 220 Triathlon series. See the Streak Podcast episode 16 for loads of info about that first year of the 220 series, a game changer for British triathlon at the time. The first version of Total Fitness opened on Gorse Hill in Swindon in 1985. The one I visited for the first time in the spring of 1989 and then again at the end of 1989 was at 30 Morley Street, which had a handy car park just opposite. In May 1993, Total Fitness Swindon moved to 109 and 110 Commercial Road. The new shop was only 50 metres from the old one, so you could still use the same car park. By then, they'd also opened stores in Bath and Nottingham. I was a regular at the Bath shop when I was a student, reading magazines without buying them and touching equipment that I couldn't afford. Total Fitness were also present at events. They set up a tent near Transition, with plenty of everyday and exotic stuff. The 220 and Total Fitness crew used to travel around in an enormous Winnebago. Was it Trevor's or John's? I need to find out. The business was a big deal in the late 80s. The first triathlon shop, I'm not sure. There were a few, especially in and around London, but definitely a must-visit venue for the young, ambitious triathlete back then. I wore the Triathlon Pro wetsuit for maybe 3 seasons, until I grew out of it. Triathlon Pro was started by British triathlete Paul Robinson White, with help from established Cornwall-based wetsuit manufacturers Solar. They also did some cool leisure wear. See an ad from 1988 in the show notes. I had one of their t-shirts. By the way, I also mentioned Paul Robinson White in TSP3, link in the show notes, as he co-invented an aero bar called the MB bar, named after his collaborator, Martin Burley. The British Triathlon Association first officially allowed wetsuits of any kind in 1986, and they had to be sleeveless and with legs only as far as the knee. They were known as shorties. This was despite the fact that the European Triathlon Union, for their first championship races in 1985, allowed long john suits. These suits were sleeveless but with long legs. Not mirroring the ETU rules was a crazy decision by the BTA, especially as the 1986 ETU Short Distance Championships were due to be held in Milton Keynes. Yes, correct. The Buckinghamshire New Town was to host Europe's most important triathlon of the 1986 season. Milton Keynes was pretty much the UK's triathlon capital for a few years in the 1980s. For the volume of triathlons organised locally, the cool facilities for training, and for hosting several championship events, as the town also welcomed the 1987 Le Coq Sportif Grand Prix final. But on the 22nd of June 1986, the water at Willen Lake was a super chilly 13 degrees centigrade, and the British athletes found themselves feeling even cooler than their rivals. as continental European athletes turned up with their long john suits, while the BTA would not budge and stuck firm by their shorty rule for home athletes. Here's a quote from the race report in French, link in the show notes. The British athletes were cursing their federation, as the BTA doesn't allow the wearing of wetsuits with full-length legs. Just a detail, most definitely not, as going against what other national federations have agreed can only damage the recognition the sport receives in the UK, while putting their athletes at a competitive disadvantage. But why weren't the BTA allowing suits with full-length legs? Here's Dave Bellingham, a triathlete since 1983 and who also held many posts in British triathlon, writing in 220 magazine in November 1992. The 1986 BTA AGM was held in February at West Bromwich, where the main debate of the day was wetsuits. Much of the discussion centred on whether they were fair or not. Remember, in the early days of the sport, the element of toughness remained an important tenet of the sport's appeal. The aspects of safety were raised, and the end result was to allow wetsuits, but they were to be limited to the shape of tri-suits, i.e. shorties, to reduce buoyancy. Note also, this decision came after the shock of the 1985 British Long Distance Championships at Holme Pierpont in Nottingham on the 4th of August 1985. The water had been 14 degrees C, and of the 120 athletes that started, 50 people were hauled from the water and less than 50 finished. But Martin Lee told me that race organisers in the UK had started to crack in 1985 though, as he wore a shorty when representing Great Britain at the first ever ETU Short Distance Triathlon Championships at Immenstadt in Germany, and then slipped it on again the week after at that race in Nottingham. Maybe due to extra warmth and buoyancy, he had a great race, finishing second. I've also seen pictures of athletes wearing basic wetsuits at the 1985 Silver Spoon Ironman in Peterborough on the 30th of June. However, things did change officially again in 1987, as Dave Bellingham wrote about the 1987 BTA AGM at Nottingham University. Wetsuits, helmets and drafting continued to dominate discussions, with full wetsuits now to be allowed, with a maximum thickness of 3 millimeters to come into line with the ETU and the USA. I think this means sleeve suits were now allowed rather than long johns. However, if not, they definitely became legal in 1988. Oddly, looking through the UK magazines from this period, I can't see many sleeved suits. Only Triathlon Pro advertised one in 1988, although Terrapin did run a small ad in 1987 saying their suits conformed to ETU regulations, so maybe they had a sleeved suit too. Regarding that ETU decision to allow sleeved suits in 1987, in the show notes I've included a photo of the start line at the 1987 European Short Course Championships in Marseille. You can see a few sleeved suits there. Lots of Aquaman stuff, again some colourful suits, and Robin Brew, front centre, in a Speedo. But in 1988, the hardman legacy wasn't the only rubbery concern in UK triathlon. In the August 1988 issue of Triathlete UK, there was an article published titled Naughty Boys, link in the show notes. There were worries that some athletes in the UK were intentionally or accidentally wearing suits that were thicker than the allowed 3 millimeters, sourced from the USA or Australia, that then provided extra warmth and buoyancy. It seems some race organisers were planning to take fat measuring calipers to suits of any athletes they thought were naughty boys. In 1990, the ETU, BTA and ITU all allowed 5mm suits. Check out a Terrapin ad in the show notes, stating that their 1990 range conforms to new European and world regulations. I kind of remember that the law allowed 5mm bodies, but still only 3mm legs and arms. But I haven't got any hard evidence for this. It seems France never had any wetsuit taboos, whether that be shorties, long johns, suits with long sleeves, or suits with integrated hoods, judging by magazine images from Triathlete France in 1985 and 1986. Remember the audio at the top of the show from Nice in 1985? It's the first coverage of that race with visible wetsuits. But what a mix of styles. It's a really fun watch though, link in the show notes. And here's another clip.
The white streams in the middle of your screen are the lead swimmers here in Nice as they approach the shore now. When they reach land, they will begin the transition onto the bike. And at this moment, John Neighbor, American Charlie Graves leads them all, but all of the top Americans are right there with him.
You know, John, this is really unusual for so many people to be so close to the leader. Graves is used to getting out way ahead. Here he is on the left of the screen still with a beautiful, flawless stroke as he swims into the surf line. He's going to have to stand up on sharp pebbles and jog up the flight of stairs to the transition area. It's a real difficult transition period. Now here's some of the other leaders, Dave Scott and Scott Molina in the wetsuit. You know, they've just come from a difficult swim, and he's got to hustle through the transition area. Molina behind him now has to pay the price for the advantage of wearing the wetsuit during the swim. He's got to slowly unzip it from behind, and Mark Allen, who enjoyed the wetsuit earlier, also has to get rid of this now obsolete equipment like caps and goggles. And it's no easy feat getting out of a wetsuit, even if the water is 71 degrees warm.
So we see Dave Scott and Charlie Graves coming out of the water in swimming trunks. Yves Cordier in a sleeveless long john, Molina in a blue and hot pink suit by ProMotion. He takes it off in the water. The neoprene looks thick and inflexible by modern standards. Then Mark Allen in a suit with long sleeves and a hood. Oddly, the legs are very high cut. Like Molina, he kind of struggles getting it off. Many of the early suits you saw on the French scene in the mid to late 80s were made by Aquaman, which Yves Cordier was probably wearing in the clip above. Aquaman, a spin-off from diving suit company Merian, started producing triathlon-specific wetsuits from 1984. After testing prototypes in 1983, the Aquaman Shorty was available for the following season. Then a long john in 1985, and long-sleeve suits with thicker neoprene, and even one with an integrated hood in 1987. There's a chance Mark Allen was wearing a prototype of that in Nice in 1985. I've put a few Aquaman ads from 1986 and 1987 in the show notes. Aquaman is still around today and super popular on the French triathlon scene. It's also worth looking at Nice 1986 from about the 4-minute mark, link in the show notes. A year on, nearly everybody is in a wetsuit, lots of Aquaman and some long sleeves. Although still not allowed in ETU championship races, countries could create their own local wetsuit rules. There are also a few shorties, and there's Scott Molina in the ProMotion again. That brings me on to the suit I'd love to get hold of, and I check eBay regularly for one. But so far nothing. Second-hand suits don't have a very long life, I guess. But surely there's a box of new old stock somewhere in France. That suit is the Winning Club branded Aquaman sleeveless suit. Winning Club was a membership scheme run by Off-Press, Jean-Claude Garreau's Brussels-based company that published all the triathlete titles. In the July 1988 issue of Triathlete UK, you can see Glenn Cook on a Winning Club ad wearing the suit. Membership of the Winning Club was £14.95. You got worldwide multi-sport insurance. That was, quote, one of the numerous advantages the biggest sports club in the world offers, end quote. You had to send in a stamped addressed envelope, though, to find out about other Winning Club activities and its membership benefits. The address was 11 Well Lane, London, SW14 7AE. This is actually the address of a pub called The Plough. Now I have a triathlon mystery I need to solve on my next visit to London. From 1987, you could find order forms for Winning Club branded wetsuits in Triathlete France. The price of a suit was 695 French francs for the sleeveless version. That's about €106 today. Although, if you weren't a Winning Club member, you had to pay an extra €7.50 to join. I thought they were super cool, and the yellow and blue stripes defined an era of exotic start lines. a time when we had to get our triathlon coverage and knowledge through studying photos in magazines. As I previously mentioned, I think by the end of the 1991 season, I'd grown out of my Triathlon Pro wetsuit. And this was when I bought my favourite ever suit by a company called Hydratech. For a few summers, maybe 1991 to 1993, I worked at Perfect Performance. Perfect Performance imported and distributed triathlon products. These included head wheels, grip shift, sport lace and Swans goggles. One of the company owners was top British triathlete Rick Kiddle. Rick was one of the first triathletes from the UK to spend a winter training in San Diego. I bought my Hydratech wetsuit from Rick as he was sponsored by them and got me a good price. It was a sleeveless suit but with short blue lycra half arms. I wore it at least until the end of 1996. I've put an ad for the Hydratech suits in the show notes. The athlete exiting the water in the suit is Rick. There's also a photo of me wearing mine while leading the 1996 Dole Triathlon in France. It's still the best suit I've ever owned, for look, feel and performance. The bright blue arms also made you easy to spot by spectators. The USA story I don't know as fully, but it seems a bit more complicated. Here's a clip from the 1987 USTS Baltimore race. It seems although rules were locked down by the BTA, ETU and CONADET in France, in the USA it was more of a choice still, and a controversial one, as the safety versus buoyancy and speed debate was still raging.
But more than just the pros, we have some top amateurs and some very interesting stories, including some controversy this year involving the use of wetsuits. Our race coverage commentator, Carl Thomas, has more on that.
For years, scuba divers have used wetsuits to fight off the cold. Obviously safety related. The second factor, buoyancy. The rubber floats in the water. Well, triathlon today, we're seeing a new innovation. Wetsuits are now being used as a competitive advantage. The top elite triathletes today will be using wetsuits to keep their bodies up high in the water. It gives them a buoyancy factor and a competitive edge, and it's highly controversial. Some of the better swimmers really feel like wetsuits should be disallowed. The Tri-Fed USA rule is very ambiguous on the subject, so for 1987, it's all systems go with wetsuits, and we're going to see a lot of them out here today. Within seconds, the male professionals hurl themselves into the calm waters of the Chesapeake Bay, and the race is on. With hearts pounding and arms and legs thrashing against the water, the group begins to spread out immediately. New Zealander Rick Wells, the early leader, former New Zealand national swimming champion, former New Zealand national lifeguarding champion. It's not hard to understand why Rick Wells is the best triathlon swimmer in the world. Multicolored wetsuits cling to the bodies of most of these professional triathletes. They believe the suits will quicken their times and help keep them buoyant through the water. And for the better part of the 20-minute swim, these athletes will put every ounce of energy into each stroke and each kick and each action they use to move them through the water and toward shore. You can see Rick's wetsuit there doesn't have any sleeves on it. It does, however, go all the way to his ankles. And as Rick Wells swims through the Chesapeake Bay, take a look at that water. 10 minutes after the men's pro start, it's time for the pro women to line up, to gather on the shore for their eventual journey through the waters of Chesapeake. Like the men who started before them, these ladies walk to the starting line, and they're ready to begin. She can see some of the lead women here taking advantage of the shallow water, running as far as they can, then dolphining through the water. Please note also that the wetsuits are visible on most all of these ladies. Again, the belief is that the buoyancy will give them a competitive edge through the water. Wetsuits may give them a competitive edge, but wetsuits have also created one of the biggest controversies in the sport of triathlon today.
I feel that wetsuits should be allowed if the water is under 70 degrees, but when the water is 70 degrees and above, people are using wetsuits for the wrong reasons. They're using them to swim faster and add extra buoyancy, and I feel right now it's an unequal, unbalanced triathlon as it is, and it just gives people more of an advantage and at a disadvantage to the better swimmers. I am going to wear a full wetsuit tomorrow because I want to place in the top 5, and I can't afford to lose time in the water. I thought that us as professional athletes looked really rather silly out there in wetsuits. But they are faster. The speed suits are faster. And now I really am forced to wear one. If all the other pros are wearing them and they are faster, I feel like I have to. I'd rather see them banned. But I can't give the other professional women the edge by letting them wear one and myself not wear one. They're not being used for the right purposes. If it's cold water, I'm for it. I think if the water temperature is cold and it could be a safety problem, they should be allowed. But when it's 80-degree temperature outside and everybody's wearing them just to have an edge and to be a little faster in the water for flotation, we may as well be using pull buoys and paddles.
Outlaw the wetsuits unless the water's cold, so that the emphasis is on skill as opposed to on technology. In other words, I'd be very happy if you were to say no wetsuits if the water's above a certain temperature and no fancy bikes.
Well, I do feel that wetsuits help, but personally I feel much more comfortable in them, maybe if it is a little bit cold. But also, I just feel so much safer out there. When you do get bumped or knocked or something, you know you're not going to go down. And I feel very comfortable with it. As far as the competitive edge, I think we're seeing most everyone, at least in the professional division, in them now. And so I don't think anyone's really getting a whole lot of edge over somebody else. I feel better in it personally, and so that helps me mentally and that I'm more ready for the swim.
I feel that because everybody's getting in the wetsuit, it's almost like nobody has a wetsuit. I mean, it is helping the substantially worse swimmer, but you're not going to see that in the pro ranks anyway, because everybody at that level has already established themselves to be decent swimmers.
The confusion clearly wasn't helped by the US Triathlon Federation, TriFed. According to an article published in the Informer column of Triathlete USA in April 1987, TriFed were only recommending that 22 degrees centigrade was used as the upper limit for wetsuit use, although race organisers were also allowed to adjust that by 2 degrees centigrade plus or minus at their discretion. The voices we heard there were host of the race coverage John Paul Dellacamera, race director Carl Thomas, pro athletes Karen Checker-Pfeiffer and then Jan Ripple, over 40 age grouper Brooke Messerole, and then 2 more pro athletes, Kirsten Hansen and Joy Hansen. Note that the temperature of the water in Baltimore was 23 degrees centigrade. The ETU did not allow wetsuit use at 23 degrees centigrade and above in 1987. There's an excellent article on triathlonhistory.com written by Scott Tinley. It covers early wetsuit developments in the States. Link in the show notes. It starts with Scott's early wetsuit experimentation with O'Neill in 1982, talks about Body Glove's marketing move to provide free body-only suits to all competitors at the 1983 Rico LA Ironman, and Scott's realization from seeing prototypes in Australia that tight, smooth suits with long legs and high necks were the way to go. Also the shift from thinking suits weren't only good for safety and cold protection, but also buoyancy and therefore speed. And finally, the emergence of Quintana Roo in 1987, when Dan Emfield was tinkering with suits purely for triathlon, not being distracted by having to produce products for surfing or other water activities. So that's it. Remember to check out thestreakpodcast.com/podcast/21 for the show notes to this episode. You absolutely need to check out all the images of those early wetsuits. So if you've got a question, a correction, some extra historical information, or just want to say hi, you can email me at thestreakpodcast@gmail.com. I'll leave you with Frank Shorter and Jim Simpson at the 1991 St. Croix Triathlon. To know all about that race, check out TSP20. Link in the show notes.
And down in the water, remember Robin Brew, Wolfgang Dietrich, and Richard Wells all in front of the pack, and Mike Pigg is hanging in there with the men, Lindy Ingram, Karen Smyers, and Jan Ripple for the women. These are the men.
And they're all lined up, just swimming along, very content to let Robin Brew take the lead and just push the pace. Now, they're lined up here because you actually can draft in swimming. This is a very good example of this. This is Richard Wells drafting off Robin Brew, and he's staying very close in that water that has no turbulence in it. It's nice and smooth, and you can actually get pulled along.
Nothing has changed here. Wells, Brew, Dietrich, Mackel, and Mike Pigg all up in front of the men. Ingram, Smyers, and Ripple for the women. But I've got another question for you, Frank Shorter, and that is, no one is wearing a wetsuit. And in other triathlons around the world, we do see the use of wetsuits.
Jim, that has to do with the water temperature. Once the water gets above 72 degrees, wetsuits are disallowed. And I think this is good because the wetsuit innovation in triathlons has really allowed swimmers who aren't technically as competent to stay much, much closer in the pack. And I think it's really given them an unfair advantage. On the other hand, once the water gets below, say, 55 degrees, it's probably dangerous not to allow wetsuits. So it really is a problem. But I enjoy watching triathlons where everyone really is battling the elements like this with no unfair advantage.
And as a hometown boy, I will tell you that the water does not get under 72 degrees here in the waters off St. Croix. So there will be no wetsuits at all.